are still entering the room, but I suggest we start this webinar. My name is Jan van Driel. I'm the Professor of Science Education at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you today our very distinguished speaker, Professor Dana Zeidler from the University of South Florida, Tampa in the USA. Dana is a distinguished university professor of science education there. He obtained his PhD from Syracuse University way back in 1982 and has since then built a very strong research profile in science education, and his interests include various topics such as argumentation and discourse, moral and ethical reasoning, nature of science, but most of all, socio-scientific issues. And that's what will be the topic of today's talk as well. If you look up Dana Zeidler's Google Scholar profile, you'll see that he has more than 10,000 citations of his work, and his most cited works, I think the 10 most cited works, except one, 9 of them have the word socioscientific in the title. So that's clearly his most prolific area of research expertise. Dana was also the president from 2010 to 2012 of NARST. NARST is an American association, but it calls itself a global association for research on science teaching. And I probably, the tag is a little bit different from that. And NARST every year recognizes some of its most eminent scholars, and Dana received the Distinguished Contribution to Science Education through Research Award from NARST in 2016. He is currently the editor of the Journal of Research in Science Teaching. I think his term is ending this year, and JRST, or JARST, the Journal of Research in Science Teaching, is and has been for a long time the most the journal in science education research with the highest impact factor. Dana and I go back quite a while. We first met in 2003 when the European Science Education Research Association held its conference in the Netherlands. And being part of the program committee, I organized a bike ride. And that bike ride, Dana was one of the participants. That turned out to be quite a memorable event. Some tiny incidents, nobody was taken to hospital. I think somebody lost their cardigan. But for many years after, whenever we met at a conference, we would happily be talking about that bike ride. I was on the board of NARST when Dana was president, which was a very learning experience for myself. And I think our last substantial meeting was in 2018 when we were both invited to spend a week in Beijing National University and gave a few workshops to PhD students. So we've been working together for quite a while, and very happily so. And I won't spend more of the time that I've already done. Again, I'm very happy to hand over to Dana Zeidler for his talk. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me here. And if you'll give me just about 5 seconds, I'll see if I can actually share my screen with you. And we will start with this. So hopefully you see one nice big screen on your end. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I wanted to say, first of all, good evening from Florida, and good afternoon to you, or wherever you are in the world. I hope you're doing well. And I did want to note that Jan is correct. We do go way back. He just seems to follow me around a lot of places. So if you see, it just keeps popping up in all these pictures. But we've had a good collegial relationship, and that's what's great about our profession, is meeting fantastic people in the world. So the title of this talk has to do with serendipity and science education, and serendipity and SSI in particular. And I wanted to know, I wanted to give you the quote by Horace Walpole, and this is where the word seems to have cropped up in 1754. Shows you that I'm most current on the research that's going on right now, and you can read the quote for yourself. But the thing I wanted you to take away from that is, in serendipity, it's a word that rolls right off your tongue, constitutes a happy knack for making unexpected and delightful discoveries by accident. And it's not really accident in the sense where it just happens to be a random chance. It's more that the inquirer has a cognitive and emotive predisposition to notice what otherwise might pass you by. So it consists of a knack, a predisposition, and something wonderful that happens. So you might think of serendipity as the gift of finding, by some combination of chance and wisdom, certain valuable or agreeable things not sought while in the pursuit of something else. And I think that's what SSI really does when it's done well. And we'll get back to that too. I just wanted to also point out that there's an emotive nature of the act of discovery that comes with a sense of happiness and pleasure and delight. And I think SSI helps us to do that as well. I wanted to give you a little bit of historic background about me and where I came from and what led up to this SSI framework. And so if you bear with me, I thought I'd take you back to even an earlier date than Jan had mentioned. And this is when I was a high school senior in 1972 in New York, where I was in high school. And I was your typical average kid, I think. Well, all right, I lied a little bit. Honestly, I was your typical below average kid, at least if you go by GPA in high school. But I'd rather like to think of it as your typical below average kid in the possession of untapped potential. But things sometimes happen as one grows up, and it stays with you. So right after my 18th birthday, I was part, and I've never shown these pictures before. It's not exactly on my Vita that you'll find this. But this is during the Vietnam War, keep in mind. And I sort of intervened in a skirmish when somebody else was getting hurt, so another student. And so I stepped into the fray of things. As a result, they took me away as well, too. So I have this sense of social justice, this sense of righteous and moral indignation. And I won't go into the details unless you have a beer with me sometime. But I can tell you that over the whole course of a year, it was a pretty strange event. And I was just astounded that people of the law can lie under oath. And at the same time, I was aware that I had a certain white privilege before anything was called white privilege, because I knew that people like my friend here that were a different color than I was would not have gotten the same breaks in terms of lawyers and money that was able to be spent on me to try to get me out of this mess over the course of a year. At the same time, I was also aware that Richard Nixon, during our Watergate scandal, one of our former presidents, had also been lying under oath and deceiving the public. I sort of made an inferential leap that the whole system seemed to be kind of corrupt from the local level where I was involved in up through the White House. And I think it left a type of experience that left a certain mark on the slate, on my slate, this sense of righteous indignation and social justice. So I'll get back to that. And I still want to keep in mind that the serendipity is this predisposition to wonder and this inclination to act. And I guess I had this in the back of my mind as I went on to college and proceeded in the hard sciences. You'll see my different degrees. And in between, somewheres after my bachelor days, I began to take a different path, I think, and it followed the path of science education. And so if we kind of zoom in a little bit more on my university days, graduate days, you'll see that I had a lot of coursework in the history and philosophy and sociology of education, in addition to my science background, and a lot of work in developmental psychology, and of course my major was science education. I needed to learn more about moral development, and I was sent by Syracuse to different scoring workshops at Harvard University, led by Larry Kohlberg, and some of you may know his theories of moral development. And I taught interesting, for 1 year, I taught at a maximum security prison, more about that in a few seconds, in upstate New York, courses in biology and bioethics. Bioethics had never been taught before at the Syracuse University main campus, let alone in a maximum security prison. Later, I taught middle school, physical science, and finally my dissertation work at Syracuse. And I would say that I think I was mentally equipped for this excursion. I had a predisposition to wonder about aspects of science education if they can contribute in some way to a more just world. So I should tell you that my original title of my dissertation, and I'll clean this up for you, but you can fill in the biological terms, I suppose, for this, were, why are there so many asses in the world? It was a little more extensive than that. And my committee thought it was pretty good, but they didn't think it would fly for the Graduate School of Education. So the title became Identifying Mediating Factors of Moral Reasoning in Science Education. And so I still have this inclination to discover and to act more about what science education can do, if possible, to address issues of social justice and ecological justice. We didn't call it that exactly back then, but that's what the movement became after some time. And you can see that my central claim of the dissertation was really looking at how factors beyond cognitive development and intellectual development could contribute to the welfare of individuals, because everything back in those days was cognitively oriented. And here I was coming in trying to put on a layer of moral development onto this. And so I need to do a few shout outs first, because you don't get to where I am alone. And I had some exemplary professors at Syracuse, Thomas F. Green, who was chairman of the Cultural Foundations Department, and Larry Kohlberg, again, from Harvard University. I didn't do a lot of work with him, but enough that he impacted my work. And it was interesting because Green suggested that I really look at more work in developmental psychology and moral development. And so when I went to see Larry Kohlberg on the right, he suggested that I look into more work on moral philosophy, and he suggested I should see Tom Green. I didn't realize that these people know each other, and Green, of course, was on my committee. So over the years, the work that I've been doing has been a collective effort, and I can't possibly name everybody involved. I'll mention a few names like, if you see the cursor here, Troy Sadler and Fawad El-Khalek and Ben Herman and Hanju Lee in Korea, and a colleague, Mitch Ruzak, that I do a lot of work with now, and Norman Judy Letterman. So there's a lot of people that are part of this process. There are many doctoral students, dozens and dozens in this country and other countries that have contributed to the process. And I couldn't have done all this work alone, but they were enthusiastic about the venture. So let me go back to this idyllic Syracuse University in upstate New York, beautiful campus. And I'm going through this, the program, and I'm learning about moral philosophy and moral development and trying to think of how this all connects to science. I'm going to be teaching at this middle school in a little bit, but in between that 1 year, I taught for the independent study degree program of Syracuse University at Auburn Correctional Facility. This is a maximum security prison, and they were known for the world's first electrocution. And it was interesting because I was quite aware of the guards with high-powered rifles and gun towers as I would walk my way across the quad after steel doors closing behind me. And I had a class of individuals, 50 individuals, and we were doing a course in biology and then bioethics. And I began this just community approach to science education, teaching science concepts, but trying to embed them in moral dilemmas and a little bit of moral philosophy. So we were looking at a democratic, participatory, social justice kind of classroom setting. It had argumentation and looking at support for evidence. And we had great topics like, can prisoners consent to chemical castration, have to have time shaved off their sentence? What about, can they consent to therapeutic trials in medicine for the same outcome? Can there ever be free and informed consent in a system that's inherently coercive and restrictive? What about consent for minors or individuals with cognitive disabilities? We looked at topics like active versus passive euthanasia, which is an interesting one given that this is where electrocutions take place. And we went into principles of ethics like meta-ethics and normative ethics and principles of deontology and utilitarianism. And it was really quite an experience, and I wish in another talk I would have more time to tell you in more detail how that class kind of rose to the occasion. And it was interesting to have prisoners be given unreasonable orders by a prison guard and come back quoting Voltaire to the prison guard. A very interesting dynamic. But this gave me this sense of working with science in a way that was more impactful and meaningful. And it got me to think about why we teach using proxies of critical learning. And we do this in every subject area. We have algebra as a proxy for symbolic and abstract thought. We teach geometry as a substitute for logic. History and social studies, typically in schools, are a proxy for conflict and social processes and change. And literature is a proxy for human behavior and self-expression. And certainly traditional science education has been taught as a substitute for really inquiry and skepticism. And it kept dawning on me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, but I thought, why not be able to teach through authentic, meaningful learning experiences, through intellectual, social, and physical immersive academic experiences, which provide an engaging context for learning subject matter. So that was the background for socioscientific issues. And it was a framework then developed from moral development and epistemological orientations of students. We looked at how people formulate knowledge, how they frame that knowledge, how they parse out that knowledge in different ways, how they reject knowledge, and how they justify their knowledge construction and the decisions they ultimately make. And I know I'm going to fly through a lot of this pretty quickly, but I understand you do have access to this and you can look at these studies in more detail if you like. I just listed 10 studies, there were more, but I thought that these probably 10 studies capture most of the salient aspects of the SSI framework. And socioscientific issues, or SSI, I think people, at least in the field of science education, most people have an inkling that they're these controversial and ill-structured dilemmas, scenarios, but they're going to require evidence-based reasoning. We're going to use deliberate scientific topics that require students to engage in dialogue, discussion, and argumentation. And for me especially, they'll tend to have implicit or explicit moral and ethical components that are going to necessarily require some degree of moral reasoning. And also for me, and I'm not sure everybody shares this, but the formation of virtue and character is a long-range goal, long-range pedagogical goal that's often associated with SSI frameworks. So the pedagogical goal for SSI is to create this immersive academic experience that provides students with a context, a meaningful personal context of their subject matter. And the underlying premise is that there are human relationships that are at the heart of this learning process, and they're fundamental for improving developmental and social moral outcomes for students. So in the interest of time, I won't go into all the details of this, but if you look at learning as a continuum, this is oversimplified, of course, and you look at traditional versus progressive pedagogy, the kind of traditional science that we still do and have typically done in the past, when students' knowledge tends to be developed by faith. It's what the teacher says, it's what my book says, or my parents said. Sources of authority are external to them. And it requires a sense of dependence, and that's going to be that they become dependent on these sources of authority for their knowledge. And if you move all the way to the other end of a continuum in a more progressive framework, their sense of knowledge and knowledge construction and justification is done by actions and deeds. They tried it, they figured things out, they collectively experimented, they did investigations, they argued. And so the learning outcome is one that develops more of a sense of autonomy. And I think it's clear that the SSI framework tends to be instantiated more in this progressive tradition. And of course, there are all kinds of happy points along this continuum too. And I'm picking the two extremes to get that point across to you. And I should also mention that I think the SSI framework, the way I envision it, is embedded in Aristotle's notion of a virtual ethic approach to human understanding. Eudaimonia, human flourishing; phronesis, practical wisdom in action, a type of moral intelligence; and arete, which is civic virtue based on excellence, fulfilling one's potential. And if you don't fulfill your potential, if you give up too easily, you fall short of the mark, then you're not a fully formed virtuous person, at least according to Aristotle. So under the SSI framework, these are the things that we're trying to achieve. So there's an underlying normativity of values in the SSI framework in science education. And I think that there's been this bifurcation of science over time that we call it the fact-value distinction or the fact-value myth. And these two distinct components, in my mind, are a myth. We tend to have, historically, in the quadrivium of the sciences, the hard sciences, these non-normative components. What are science? Well, what do? We gather data, we make observations, we make predictions, we do measurement, we conclude, control variables. You get the idea. But I see that you can't draw any sharp line, I think, between scientific thinking and mere philosophy, because all data is interpreted against some background of theory or different theories. And different theories come bundled with a fair amount of contextual reasoning. And those are the normative components of science, the trivium. So what we tend to do is prescribe courses of actions. We have this knowledge, but we have to act on that knowledge, right? So we need to create, select purchases, products, to make decisions about what ought to be done, considering different multiple perspectives, exercising a sense of conscience, and having a sense of empathy in making decisions about how it impacts the world around you, people and the environment. And so I think this this fact-value distinction is an artificial distinction. It's been an artificial divorce. And it's pitted these non-normative components against the normative components. And I think that the danger is that it leads to an abdication of any sense of personal responsibility if you're only operating in that non-normative sphere. So scientific literacy, as I envision it, it's a sense of responsible decision-making. And so I understand that while literacy in and of itself may not require a moral compass, scientific literacy, in the sense that I am prescribing, does. And this leads to a sense of being socially responsible. And to those who suggest that, well, what virtues are you going to teach? It's a bag of virtues approach, so what do you pull out? And again, I go back to Aristotle's Nigomachean Ethics, but I think I haven't heard a good counter-argument to things like reliability and trustworthiness and dependability and empathy and compassion are virtues that we ought not to think about or strive for in education. So if you convince me that they're the wrong things we should be aiming for, I'll listen. But so far I haven't heard that argument. So a lot of the work that Sami Khan, a former doctoral student and now another professor at Princeton University, and I have worked on is thinking about perspective taking, empathy, and what's needed in science education, which is this moral context. So you can see on one hand that you need to have, for perspective taking to take place, necessary and sufficient conditions or a type of engagement in the problem at hand, and this Edic/emic shift, this insider and outsider perspective. Perspective taking requires engagement plus the ability to shift in one's perspective. And that's a generic condition of perspective taking. But the way I think about it with respect to the SSI framework is that you need to have that same engagement on figure B in the bottom and perspective taking with this edict to emic shift, but it has to be embedded in a moral context. And so you can think of this edict to emic insider to outsider shifting as molecules going through a semi-permeable membrane, and it needs to achieve some type of equilibrium. And it's not until you reach that equilibrium in which you then have a fair and just resolution of a problem. So we've talked about how this perspective taking is part of the socioscientific construct of socioscientific reasoning. I know there's a lot of acronyms, SSR. Troy Sadler's work and colleagues have explored SSR in more detail, and the socioscientific reasoning constructs entail the ability to understand the complexity of problems. It's not a first blush impression, there's layers behind any SSI issue, examining the issues from multiple perspectives, realizing the need for ongoing inquiry, invoking skepticism about data and even the conclusions that you may reach, and understanding, Troy's edited a fifth one recently, understanding the affordances and limitations of science applied to the resolution of issues. And so in our framework, we're trying to elevate perspective taking in a way that's tapping into role-taking abilities, empathy, theories of mind, and developing these other SSR reasoning skills. And I promise you, I'm not going to go into the weeds on this, because I'm trying to give you just an overview, and you can always go into these studies for more detail. And if you wanted to question the methodological rigor and integrity of the studies, you can look at the publications themselves. So this is the big broad brushstroke overview. And what we're trying to work on is developing students' epistemological reasoning, because we are suspect that it's going to be necessary, and maybe not sufficient, condition for socioscientific reasoning to take place. So that's the underlying goal. And I'm going to pass over a few slides here and just go to some outcomes of SSI in the research. So there are many studies that you can look at that are published. And so you can doubt me on this, and you can look at the studies, and you may decide that they're not worthy, but they're out there and they're published, and you can make those judgments. But from our point of view, we will maintain that we have studies that show these important outcomes. There's statistical and practical significance of showing, excuse me, how SSI has been able to enhance and promote reflective judgment, reflective reasoning, and epistemological development. Develop empathy and caring. There are ways to operationalize it and measure it. It may not be the total way to think about it, but we have some indicators of it. It's produced more robust argumentation, elevated discourse. Doing SSI done well can improve students' understanding to more robust understandings of the nature of science and scientific inquiry, conceptual understanding of scientific content. People ask me, but is they're going to learn anything? We find that they do. And you can read the rest. Character development, the work by Han-Ju Lee and colleagues in Taiwan show that they develop more robust ecological worldviews and a sense of socioscientific accountability and moral and social compassion. So all kinds of outcomes, but the interesting thing for us is that these have been done for elementary, middle school, and high school and college as well. So I used to work mostly at the middle and high school levels, but I've had other individuals that are great teachers that have convinced me that this can be done at the younger levels as well. And so I thought I'd spend more time showing you some of this in action. So let's take a closer look. By the way, I just had to find a reason to get my dog in the picture, so that's Sophie. And I wanted to look at the work in particular of these individuals, because they've done a lot in terms of implementing this in different ways in science education. So I won't go into all the details of how the course was structured, but if you wanted to look at one article by Herman, Zeidler, and Newton in 2018, Students' Emotive Reasoning Through Place-Based Environmental Socioscientific Issues, I think it would give you a really good insight into how we develop these SSI themes throughout an immersive course that are going to place students in the environment with different actors, real people that are different stakes in situations involving, in this case, the release of gray wolves in a natural environment in Yellowstone National Park. And again, we're not going into the weeds. I don't want you to read all the details, but I just want to show you that we have gone into detail in these papers where we try to really examine the different categories of emotive reasoning that bubble up through the data. These aren't a priori categories. These are categories that are reflected out of the data. And we look at different forms of what we call passive care towards the environment and towards people that interact with the environment. And what we try to strive towards is a type of empathetic dissonance, where people feel uneasy about the situation and are willing to investigate it in more detail and have more of a stake in it. And when you look at the end results here of anger and righteous indignation, that's sort of reflective of what I went through back in high school, that sense of righteous indignation about, why does this have to be this way? Are there more just decisions that we can make? And so in this case, righteous indignation is more than just another degree of anger. It's those expressing it also appear to perceive that there are moral principles of equity and justice that are violated. And And when you get this, I think you get the best peak developmental talents the students are capable of at that point in time. And again, not to go through all this in detail, but I just want to show you that we have laid out in these articles, we've illustrated these different emotive reasoning patterns that are triggered by different contexts of the problems at hand. And when you look at some of the results, if you look at the black, you could just simply take a quick look at pre-SSI instruction and after this immersive course for 10 days out in the wilderness and 4 weeks afterwards, that you can see some of these emotive factors, in this case for anthropocentric or people-centered empathy, that are involved in these SSI dilemmas in Yellowstone National Park. There's a definite shift to these higher levels of compassion and care and righteous indignation. And it's really hard to get students to really think about things that are not people-oriented, to think about things that are environmentally related. And we've been able to show shifts in understanding the importance of ecosystems and the role they play, the physical environment. And so we've been able to get some moderate shifts of ecocentric empathy or nature-centered empathy as well in our work. So I really wanted to show you now just a lot of pictures, and I'll zoom through them, of some of this in action. So Yellowstone National Park is a pretty huge area that's around Montana, and Idaho, and Wyoming. I'm going to fly through this. It covers 80,000 square kilometers. It's an incredible ecosystem because of its geomorphic structures that are taking place, volcanic activity. But when you are walking through the park, it's just beautiful. And you see the remnants of all this geologic activity that's taking place, the new mountains being formed, evidence of tectonic plates where they're shifting underground, thermal vents, and it's just this incredible experience. And what we wanted to do is to get students to begin to understand how these little small towns that are nestled in these areas need to interact with the environment around them, and how the tourist industry that comes and the hunters that comes are all part of this. So when you go around Yellowstone, like 90% of these are my pictures, you'll come across these face-to-face interactions with animals. And with a telephoto lens, you can't really get too close to the wolves because they stay away from the humans, but they're just magnificent creatures to see. And there's other wildlife, or grizzly bears, and believe me, this was a telephoto lens, I'm not getting that close. But you're also interacting with wildlife by just walking through these little towns. You're seeing evidence when you're walking through these trails of where the bears, in this case, have been sharpening their claws, rubbing their winter fur off on the tree that you see, and generally finding a good place to itch themselves when they need to. But the students, for the first time, are really seeing how animals are interacting with the nature around them, the cycles of life that they go through in different winters. They're beginning to understand something about the carrying capacity of land, population dynamics, diseases in wildlife populations, and human impact on ecosystems. So these are students, this is Ben Herman actually here, but these are students that are out talking to ranches and looking at the problems that ranches have with controlling wolves and the livestock that are keeping the livestock healthy that are around them. So it's a real problem, especially when the difference between having a few calves that are killed and not killed is the difference between making it through a winter or not making it through a winter and having any income. The students are interacting with wildlife biologists. This is a tracking device by one. You can see some of the collars that are worn on these animals, and you get a sense of the size of them by the size of that collar. And they're talking to Native Americans, indigenous people, about their views of the reintroduction of wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. They're talking with naturalists that would take us on hikes, and talking to different hunters about their own livelihood and their freedom to hunt this, and especially if you're a farmer who may be damaged by these wolves, and security systems that have to go into place around here. They're talking to different scientists, and it gets pretty real, and especially talking to different townspeople that just own local stores. So all this culminated in an SSI type of debate. We called it a civic community gathering. And it was supposed to take place in a little hotel in one of these small towns. And the one hotel that existed in the town it's one venue where we can have a little meeting was flooded out. And so we were able to do this in a local bar in town. And this is where a lot of the civic meetings actually take place, where people exchange ideas. And we had people in our college classes here that would have taken the perspectives of ranchers or Native American groups or hunter outfitters or wildlife biologists. There were other experiences that they've had with other perspectives like law enforcement and local community people and store owners, like I said. But the idea was to present, with evidence and backing and warrants to their claims, why their position should be heard and should be ruled in favor of during our town hall meeting. We had appointed 3 individuals to act as the civic guardians or Supreme Court justices, if you will, and they had to take notes and they questioned different groups, and finally they had to remove themselves for about 45 minutes and come back with a written verdict and any dissenting opinions about what group would get what they wanted out of this. So it's a really good experience in SSI types of dialogical interaction, debate, and discourse. With another individual, and you can come back to this, Mitch Ruzak here, former PhD student, and now has done all kinds of incredible things. We've done this program called Immersive Academics, where we take over a school for a week and through different simulations engage the whole school across disciplines, across subject matter, not just science, but every discipline in that school, and infuse, including administrators, by the way, in the physical plant and secretaries and parents, into these different scenarios. So this is one in which the students have been working for several weeks in building a fictitious city, but they took a lot of pride in this city, and they were responsible for trying to figure out the elements that make a city run the way it does and who's in charge of what. And they were supposed to celebrate this on one morning for the the final aspect of their city. We came in here and we closed it down. We put up this tape around here with hazmat suits. By the way, this is pre-COVID, probably not the best scenario to do right now. But Mitch came in and over the weekend and covered one of the houses they built with yogurt and left it out in the sun. And yogurt does what yogurt will do when you leave it out in the sun for 48 hours. So all kinds of colonies of growth here. We told them that there was no danger, but we're trying to investigate what happened here in more detail and we need their help. You get the idea. What's nice though is that we had different specialists come in that represented the police department, health department, and what would happen in the case of an actual emergency, and what roles they would play. And the students had to think about how to collect evidence and investigate this further. They came up with their own questions, and we would then sometimes move into more semi-structured, classroom investigations where they could look at exponential, growth of an organism. And you've probably done similar things in your science classes. And we would hit virtually every student in the whole school over that week doing these investigations. But what's really important is serendipity again would strike, because students would then begin to raise their own questions. They didn't need us or their teachers to ask them leading questions about halfway through the week. They proposed their own investigations, where to collect, where the most bacteria would grow in a school. And they were actually collecting bacteria, and they were surprised to find that door handles have more bacteria on it than in the toilet bowl. So these were their investigations, and who are we to step in the way of science? We've done other investigations with students, and I'll go through this again rather quickly, where we would have a media impact to school over the weekend, and the students would come and discover this impact of a media or potential media. We didn't really know what it was, and we needed to help to investigate this. And so the day of discovery begins with this immersive event. Of course, we took the liberty of burying some dry ice under the media and pouring some water on it. So it had the nice effects too. But the first day is always this almost chaotic scene when it's just a shock and awe, and the students are just, oh my goodness, how did this thing get here? And we never say it's a meteor. We ask them, we need your help to make excursions to find out what this is. How is it similar to things on Earth that you know about? How's it dissimilar? What was the entry path of this? Because we take the liberty of breaking some branches behind this where this thing could have come in, hit the ground. But it becomes a pretty much controlled chaos after the first day, when groups will come out with their own questions, with their own investigations to pursue. One student, or one class rather, found out that meteors contain nickel and iron ore, therefore they ought to be magnetic. So we supplied magnetic strips, and they came out and would put strips on here. And sure enough, we didn't even know, because there are no rocks in Florida. This rock came from Michigan, but Mitch has access to a landscape company. So turns out that it had some stratification in it that was slightly magnetic. So it's more data. So the point is that the students begin to form their own questions, and they begin to break apart. And we're trying to get the teachers to take over this, so our role, we can begin to step back by the last few days. We've done other investigations where it's a watershed. We find on a school property magically that there was a custodian that came out and was fixing some pipes and found an interesting artifact. So it's always somebody that they know in the school, like a trusted, gym teacher or custodian. And then we were called in to further investigate, but we're going to need the students' help to investigate this further. And as we go down different layers, we unearth different things. We've unearthed airplane parts that we just happened to put there from 1938 that were crop dusters, because Florida was farming and using crop dusters in 1938. And there's a lot to be said for imagination when we do these grids, and we have points that can ding on a metal detector, and they have to think about what these points can construct. And it turns out that these things correlate underground to the axle of a 1938 Ford truck that would have been used in the farming areas there. And just by magical chance, we also may uncover indigenous artifacts, because Calusa Indians were in this. So you begin to see all these connections across disciplines that students have. And we talk about the fact that DDT was widely applied in this area some time ago, and there are even jingles that they're to get people to buy it and to use it, because we know that any good mom would want to spray their baby in the baby's crib with DDT. So the kids have a really engaging time, but with the help of teachers and some leading questions, they begin to structure their own investigations and decide what to measure, how to measure it. We have a gym teacher here that came out and improvised. We just started to do a lesson on non-standard units of measurement. So we're looking at the impact grader and how many kid lengths this are. Then we had to convert kid lengths to football or soccer ball lengths, and then we had to convert that into a more standard length of measurement. So again, cutting the, and this is something the gym teacher just wanted to try to do, and we went along with it. The students will display this. The hallways become collections of different classes' results. So different classes are working on different aspects of these questions and problems. And the students are more adept at media than we are, or I am anyway, and will present PowerPoint presentations of their findings and why they collected the data that they did. And it's just really rewarding. Here's a picture of a student that came in, and this happened multiple times, where students came in unprompted and would show us what they dug up in their parents' yard, in their parents' garden, because they were motivated by the scenario that we had going. So I can only imagine that their parents now had holes dug in their own yard from these little kids, but they're excited to share, and they wanted to know what we thought these were, if they were old, if they were Indian artifacts, or if they were fossils and that sort of thing. And this one student came out. It was typical that even during the lunch hour, when they could go play in the playground, most students would come back and ask if they could do some more observations and draw pictures or investigate this, the different artifacts in further detail. And if we say, sure, when this one girl was drawing intently, and we said, what are you drawing? And she turned around and said, I'm drawing myself. I'm a scientist. I'm going to investigate this meteor. So it was really nice to see this sense of scientific identity shaping up unprompted. And so again, usually during the last day or two, we begin making trips into different classrooms where students can explain their theories. This little kid's going to be an astrophysicist when he grows up. He's talking to Mitch about the trajectory of the meteor that's coming in. And it leads to things like classification and sorting. This is Melanie Kingsky, a former doc student that's done a lot of work now with working with very young kids. And she's as amazed as they are, looking at volume and shape and size and mass of different objects. So all these objects come from the whole scenario. And what might be a boring sorting lesson in a classroom now has a lively context because they were excited about this event and they want to explore these features. So we're basically doing pretty standard lessons, but in this much more authentic realm, and the students are coming up with their ideas through serendipity as well too. So again, very quickly, the students every morning would go on, and we would go on their television morning announcements, and we would suggest some new things and findings that different classes would find, and we would do a little shout out, you know, like Johnny Matthew has found this, and it was really exciting, and he shared it with the rest of his class, and now we want to share it with the school. So it was a nice way to acknowledge individual students that might need a little boost along the way too. The principals were involved, the assistant principal, and again, through serendipity, we went to classrooms. We just happened to see that they had this little world map on the floor, and we began asking a few questions about meteors and where they impact Earth. And they began to wonder, what's the oldest impact, and what's the biggest one, and what's the most recent one? And so now we can, you know, be able to go online and look at that and place little markers on this rug. And students had this more of a context for understanding something about geography as well as the impact of meteors in the schools. So again, I'm going to fly through this very quickly, just about another 10 more pictures or so, because I want to leave some time for questions. So in the younger grade levels, Melanie has worked in, and Tom Dolan has worked in, another former doc student of mine, has done some great work with kids, and they were wanting to look at aspects of velocity, weight, momentum, and to make this interesting for fifth graders, we wanted to see whether or not there should be mandatory speed limits enforced. And sometimes we've used to be mandatory bike helmets that kids have to wear. And if you're not wearing one, your parents are going to get fined $500 for each violation because you didn't wear your helmet. So we try to personalize it in a way for kids. So, I mean, these are typical kinds of worksheets, but instead, Tom says, well, you know, kids can really do this well, and we just need to make it authentic investigations for them. So we have something called slip and slide. I don't know if you have it in Australia, where you can, you know, run down this wet surface and crash into the end here. And we thought this might be a good way. Actually, it was Tom's idea to look at velocity, momentum, and those sort of timing and all that sort of thing. And not everybody live in Australia or Florida where you can do this with your students. So you can do a skateboard version of this as well in school. This teacher is about 6'4", so it's kind of funny with his knees up to his chin, riding a skateboard to see how many bowling pins he knocks over, and if we can push him at a consistent speed with the same momentum from one trial to another. But out here in the field, Tom is talking about different aspects of this investigation. He wants them to run on a slip and slide. The kids refuse to do it because it's not wet. And what does wetness have to do with anything? Well, they understand that it needs to be wet because they're going to get burned. What is that? Well, that's friction. So now we're having a conversation of friction. So ultimately, he's going to wet them down, and they're shrieking and yelling, and as he gets to hose them down. I mean, how many of you have always wanted to take a hose to your students? Come on, admit it. Show of hands, you wanted to do that. So he gets to hose the students down, and there's a boys slip and slide and a girls slip and slide. They take some practice runs, but eventually you see the timers back here. So there's moms and other kids that get involved, parents of timing the kids of when they hit and how far they slide. And just to look at the thrill of the kids' faces, this is authentic science in action when you look at these faces. This girl would never go more than about 2 feet because she's very tentative. And finally, she got the courage halfway through class to take a little more of a running start. And she actually made it in slow motion to the very end. And that's the reaction when she finally made it to the end. Of course, her time was a lot bigger. Her velocity is going to be different. But all this is going to translate into discussions and arguments that they're going to have about mandatory bike helmets or mandatory speeding laws in their community and that sort of thing. But first, we're collecting the data. And of course, the teacher has to get in on this too. But this is what I wanted to show you. This is the face of real, authentic science. And this is the face of serendipity of SSI. It's a conceptual framework that favors and promotes an open mind through the exploration of perspectives, positions, and orientations, where moral ethicals intersect moral and ethical issues intersect science. And to me, this is the serendipity of socioscientific issues, but it's also the enactment of a predisposition to wonder. And so just as I had that predisposition to think about if science can help and to create a more just and environmentally friendly world, I had that inclination to wonder. What we're trying to do is infuse these kids with that same inclination to think about the world around them, to think about making decisions that are equitably just and fair. Fair doesn't mean 50-50, but take into consideration different perspectives and use science and evidence, which opens up the door for what constitutes good evidence and different authorities for evidence and that sort of thing. But use that in their decision-making and in their discourse with one another. So I want to leave you with this. This is the kid in high school, the below average kid that took 4 years to get through 2 years of French. I found a French quote, but I know it translates to, where observation is concerned, chance favors only the prepared mind. That to me is the serendipity of SSI. So I will stop sharing my screen at this point. And thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you so much, Dana, for a very inspiring and relevant talk for the moment. I love this idea of serendipity. I just wanted to remind people that they can put a question for Dana into the Q&A box. We do have a couple in there that will start us off, and we have about 7 minutes in which we can have a good discussion. So we did get a question from Anne earlier in your talk about the link between SSI and STEM, and I know you have written about this, Dana. So the question specifically was, how might SSI provide a way to help students navigate issues that matter to them within an education environment focused on STEM?
So I think I heard most of the question. You wanted to know how SSI might help STEM initiatives? Is that the essence of the question?
Yeah.
Okay. And so you're right. I've taken a little exception to the STEM bandwagon, as it's often portrayed, at least in the United States, because everybody and their pet dog has to promote STEM if you want to get a grant. And I thought that the way we typically approach STEM, not everybody, but the way we typically approach STEM is one that really doesn't do much more than the traditional kinds of teaching that we do, which is that we extend it to math and technology. We don't quite know how that connects to science always, but an engineering part, and it's cleaving off. It's that quadrivium initiative where we're looking at still only the distance between aspects of these hard sciences, and it's cleaving off that whole normative aspect of the social sciences that I think are important in terms of embedding everyday science in meaningful ways to students. So I thought the SSI framework is a sociocultural approach to examining science, and I think it could be infused within the STEM initiatives that people want to advocate for in a way that makes STEM a little more accessible to students, because it becomes more personally meaningful to them in the kinds of ways that I've described throughout this process. I hope that answers it. If I haven't done a good job responding to that, Victoria will be happy to explain that in more detail tomorrow.
Thanks, Dana. Okay, another question here from Philip, and I might need a little bit of a hand here, Philip, because there's a reference to table 2. I'm not sure if you remember table 2 in your slide, but it's discussed, oh, here he is, he's popped in, about the feelings generated in and by students. Do you encourage students to think through actions they could undertake to resolve some of the dissonance? Thanks, Philip.
Yeah, Philip, that's a great question, because a number of years ago, one of the criticisms that we received is not a bad criticism, but it was like, say you're doing these hypothetical dilemmas, and but what do students do in terms of acting on things? Being scientifically and culturally responsive to some of these issues. And it was a fair criticism, but my argument was, well, we can't do everything at once, and we need time to develop this framework over time. And so we have tried to encourage students, after they've been exposed to these, to act on some of this work, and we can't compel students to do it, but we have, Mark Newton and Ben Herman have followed up with some of our students who've done the informal science learning and found that they have carried over some of this, not everybody, but some of this in terms of their decision making with buying products, with supporting environmental causes. So we certainly try to encourage students to move beyond just talking about these issues and to action. And that's the next step. It depends also on the classroom teacher if you want to advocate to examine a cause and then write, for example, newspapers to do public service announcements, to write a congressperson or senator or the equivalent of what you may have in your country. So that's perfectly within the realm of doing SSI, and I would certainly be in favor of doing something like that as well too.
Okay, thank you. Feel free to pop more questions in there, and while we're waiting for a couple more to come in, I have something I was going to come back to, and that was, you talked about scientific literacy requiring a moral compass, and some of your other comments about empathy. I suppose there are also different brands of what a moral compass is. So how is it that you navigate that space inside some of these SSI models that you're implementing in classrooms?
Right. So, I mean, a lot of these issues, again, bubble up from the students themselves too. And what we're trying to do is to connect what might be otherwise distant and alien material in science to some portion of the students' lives. And for me, the best way that I know to do that is to create some type of dissonance, some type of conflict. Cognitive dissonance works well to get students to begin to think past their present point with respect to explaining, causal explanations for scientific phenomena. Moral dissonance, in our research, it shows that students are able to have a certain degree of tension, and it's up to a teacher that knows their students well to decide what that degree of tension is. I can't purport to tell you, go this far, but not any further. If you know your students well, you know how far you might be able to push them with that sense of moral tension. Sometimes if a different dilemma hits personally too close to home, you may have to back off and that, so some students might get upset at something and you have to be able to read that. But just the fact that there are different perspectives than your own isn't a reason to avoid discussing a topic. And it can be done in if I can do it in a maximum security prison with people that are in there for, name your thing that you've done. And if I can get them to do that in a semi-respectful way where they hear each other out and they're not talking over one another, I'm pretty sure you can do it with most children in K through 12. Thank
you. We've had a few questions come in here. So I'm going to ask a few at the same time. So a couple of questions around how do you select scenarios for different schools, and related to that, how do you work with Indigenous knowledge in the SSI approach, and any advice that you have for pre-service teachers wanting to do SSI in their own classrooms in the future?
Yeah, well, so let me take the last question last. It's hard to give you just blanket advice, but there are some, I hesitated writing a how-to book because I didn't want this to be, here's a step of scientific, approaches that you take, like a scientific method. It doesn't quite work that way. But if you're willing to spend a little time to understand the SSI framework, you can do quite well. So Sammy Khan has a book out for K through 5. Sammy Khan and myself, we both have a book out from 2000, I can't remember, 16 or 14, that's K through 12. And it gives a little snippet of the SSI framework in a non-threatening language. And then it goes into different dilemmas and how you can create your own. We have examples from almost every discipline, from chemistry, physics, biology, earth science, and for K through 12. So there are actual scenarios that you can take from that and implement them for every scenario. There are about anywhere from 5 to 7 lessons that go along with that scenario. And you can take those and use them, and you may find that you need to tweak them and leave one of the, we have like days 6, but maybe you don't like day 6, maybe you want to do days 1 and 3 and 4, and that's fine too. So there is information out there to help you set this up and get started with it. But the SSI framework, I think, and implementing this can be made infertile by infertile minds. It can be made creative by creative minds. And I think there are a lot of talented teachers out there that know their students and can take some of the things that we've given them and then infuse their own personal creativity behind it. So by now I lost track of the other questions, of course, but I want to do justice to that because the application was important.
Yeah, thank you. I'm aware of the time and I'm sure we could go on with questions for hours, but I am going to hand back to Jan. Thank you, Jan.
I should mention that if anyone wants to email me, they have my email, and I'll do my best to respond in a thorough manner.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Vic, for moderating the Q&A, and thanks, Dana, of course, for your talk. We are past 1 o'clock, and I appreciate that people may have to leave, and I know that Vic has go to teach a class. But there are a few questions, so those who still have a few minutes left, be happy to stay, and I'll repeat the question that Vic posed to you a few minutes ago. There were actually 2 that you might want to combine in your answer. One was, what guides you in selecting which scenarios to use for students in different schools? Do you modify the scenarios for different groups to match their disposition to inquirement or wonderment? And also, and it's a different question, but you might want to say something also about how you work with indigenous knowledge in SSI as part of the SSI approach. Maybe that's something also to expand on a little bit.
Yes, so the scenarios we've worked out, we've done in conjunction with teachers in a given school. So because of the specifics and history of Florida, with respect to the different indigenous groups that lived here before us, people are amazed to know that there are woolly mammoths that lived in this region as well too. And you can find evidence of this. You can find fossilized remains, and so we worked with teachers through a in-service kind of workshop, and we kind of prepare them for what may happen and what this framework entails, and then we work with them over weeks to develop specific lessons that they want infused and connected with the scenario in some way that they've also helped to develop. So the answer is that we've done it in conjunction most of the time with teachers. Sometimes we come in and suggest a few things as well too, but it's a kind of a group effort. And so it's peculiar to the specific schools that we go in and what they're studying at that point in time, and we can try to make those connections work well. With respect to tapping indigenous knowledge, other than the Yellowstone National Park experiences, I haven't had personal experience to tap that in more detail. It's something I would like to do. I don't always have the opportunity to do it. It's something that Mark Newton, one of my former students that does a lot of this work, has been able to do more successfully. That's what he's immersed in more than I am.
Okay.
But I mean, yes, I mean, it's been really important to have that perspective when you can.
Sure, sure.
It makes it more meaningful to the students to resonate with somebody that's connected to the land.
Yes, sure, and that's a big issue in Australia as well as in the US, of course. Finally, I think there's a few questions left that I can combine, and I think it's important and probably also appropriate to finish off with a question that was different versions of it were posed by different people, like how every educator, every teacher has their own biases, their own opinions, their own values, and how do you manage those when you're teaching SSI? You don't want to probably influence the students too much with your own ideas, your own opinions, but you may not always be aware of your own ideas or your own values. They may become apparent in the process of teaching SSI. Is it something that I think is important, that that we as educators and teachers are aware of our own views in regard to these issues? How do you manage that? Is that something, as a final comment, you may want to talk to?
Yeah, another great question too. And so when we've done it, and when we have teachers working with us to do it, I mean, it's always been, you know, a Pygmalion effect, an expectancy effect, right? And I'm in the position that we don't advocate what our personal opinions are about this. We try to pull out all the different perspectives that students have, and the ones that they may not come up with, we pull that out from existing literature, newspaper articles, and that sort of thing. I don't want them to feel that the teacher is the authoritative source and the final decision maker on this too. And I think most teachers get that. But what we do advocate for and do it explicitly are those normative values that I showed you a slide of earlier, where we're trying to foster a sense of responsibility and you know, a collective consciousness of the students too. So those are things we're deliberately working on, because I think that virtue ethic approach based on Nicomachean ethics from Aristotle still resonates today with developing character and virtue and those sorts of things. So that's something that's really explicit, and that's why trying to advocate for that aspect of developing character and virtue as a long-range goal of SSI. But in terms of the rubber meets the road and a day-to-day interaction with students, I'm not reviewing, this is what I think it should be. I would never go there.
Okay.
I hope that answers it.
Yes,
and
well,
I want to thank everybody. I know it's you're probably like lunchtime for you. It's past now. But I want to thank everybody that's attended this. I'm really appreciative of your interest. And again, if I can be of any help, I'll be happy to connect with people over email, and I'll do the best I can to respond to you.
Well, once again, thank you so much for making the time and giving this presentation from what looks like your living room in Florida. Of course, we would. Just, okay.
My academic man cave.
It would be fantastic if we could meet you here in Melbourne, welcome you at some point later in the future when we are able to travel again between continents, and you might then have an opportunity to meet some of the people face to face who were in the meeting today. Thank you so much for your talk, and I think I found it very inspirational, and from the comments and questions that we got, I think it has inspired a lot of people. We will definitely make the recording and the slides available to those who attended today, and it's fantastic that you are available for people who want to raise questions or discuss things with you through email, that they are invited to contact you. That's very generous. So thank you very much again. And,
I appreciate it, and you're more than welcome. And
okay.
We'll do it again sometime in person. We
will. Thank you so much.
All
that
right.
concludes today's seminar, and like Dana said, thank you all for attending today, and we'll hope to see you at the next seminar. And I don't really know on top of my head when that will be, but it's in about a month's time, and you will be invited in the usual way for that next seminar. Thank you so much.